I've divided my talk into these 7 topics. Most of the photos are mine, thanks to Leslie Falconberry and her 2005 book and website for many of the historic photos. As a boy, I loved climbing trees. Instead of our flat, two-dimensional world, I looked down on it from the 3rd dimension. But as a pilot, I'm above the trees and above the clouds, and even look at designs that I couldn't have imagined from the ground and see the sunset in a new way. No wonder that early earthbound humans imagined that God and heaven were in the sky. High Flight was written by John Gillespie Magee, an American in the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941, and is a favorite of pilots. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent lifting mind I've trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. Birds, balloons, gliders, and planes. Oh, to fly! So, how do birds do it? Flight requires 3 elements: power forward, lift upward, and control. The bird does all 3 with curved, flapping wings, but early human attempts to duplicate this method failed miserably. The first successful lift was accomplished by hot air balloons. This is Montgolfier in 1784 in France. To get lift and control, the 19th century turned to gliders. Jumping off a hill, the wings provided lift. The wing shape is called an airfoil. It looks a bit like a teardrop in cross-section, curved on top and flat on the bottom. The curved top forces the air above to move faster, and according to Bernoulli's principle, fast air has lower pressure and lifts it. Lilienthal performed many experiments on the Indiana sand dunes at the south end of Lake Michigan, east of Chicago. Octave Chanute, 1896, a Frenchman, who shared his results willingly with the Wright brothers. Orville and Wilbur Wright refined the lift and control issues using gliders before adding power. Then, on December 17, 1903, near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville and Wilbur Wright made the first successful flight in history of a self-propelled, heavier-than-air aircraft. Orville piloted the gasoline-powered, propeller-driven biplane, which stayed aloft for 12 seconds and covered 120 feet on its inaugural flight. A little known fact, this lucky picture of that flight was taken by a local non-photographer who was just told to snap the shutter as soon as the plane left the ground. Here's a model of that flight. The pilot, prone on the wing, uses wing warping for control instead of ailerons. How far we've come. Here's my best example. 115 years later, Red Bull air racers navigate a low-level slalom track marked by 25-meter-high air-filled pylons. Using the fastest, most agile, lightweight race planes, pilots hit speeds of 230 miles an hour while enduring forces of up to 12 G. I took this picture on the Detroit River, Windsor's in the background. Georgia aviation. Aviation in Georgia began with Ben Epps, the first Georgian to build and fly an airplane. In 1907, the 19-year-old built this precursor in Athens, Georgia. This was a year before the Wright's flight was generally acknowledged in America, although Europeans were all over it. 2 years later, he flew his first successful flight in Athens. Unlike the Wright's craft, Epps sat upright in a buggy seat on a single wing. Over a 30-year career, Epps was an innovator who instilled a love of flying in many young Georgians, including his own children. And the Athens Ben Epps Airport is named after him. Georgia was important to Charles Lindbergh also. In the early 1920s, he traveled with a barnstorming pilot serving as the wing walker. This statue of Lindbergh as a wing walker is in Americus, Georgia, and it celebrates that career as a wing walker. It's in Americus because that is where Lindbergh went in 1923 to buy his first plane, a World War I Jenny in a crate. With that plane, he flew solo for the first time. Sutherfield. By May of 1927, he had gotten financial support from the people of St. Louis to construct the plane in which he made his historic first solo non-stop transatlantic flight. This replica is in the Birmingham Flight Museum, which I visited last month. In his triumphal American tour, his stop in Atlanta was instrumental in building support for commercial aviation and for the Atlanta airport. He also visited the Golden Isles. This is a picture of him on Sapelo Island in 1929, the guest of Howard Coffin. The only available landing site was a cow field. I don't know what plane this is. What about Glynn County in the Golden Isles? Well, prior to the Torres Causeway in 1924, the only way to get to St. Simon's Island was by ferry. Enter Paul Redfern, musician and early aviator. In 1927, just 6 months after Lindbergh's 3,600-mile flight to Paris, Redfern planned a 4,600-mile flight from the Golden Isles to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, longer than anyone else had ever flown in one flight. Some 3,000 supporters gathered on the Sea Island beach to see his noon, August 25th, 1927 takeoff in this boxy Stinson Detroiter. Here's a close-up of that plane, Brunswick to Brazil. He took off from this beach on Sea Island. We're looking southward. Imagine him disappearing over Jekyll Island in the distance and over the horizon. He was spotted by a Norwegian freighter a few hours later, and when nearing Venezuela, he was spotted by a fisherman just off the coast. The last sighting of Redfern came the next day over Ciudad Bolivar in Venezuela, 200 miles into South America, but he failed to arrive in Rio de Janeiro. There were tremendous advances in the 1920s. Airports began to spring up. By 1930, Georgia had one commercial airport at Atlanta, 14 municipal aerodromes, and 15 of what were called intermediate fields that were just designed for emergency landings. Plus, there were many unpublished fields. Here's a map of the airways existing in the United States in 1930. The commercial routes are solid. Other published airways, not being flown commercially, are in open double lines. Notice the void of commercial flights in the Carolinas and Georgia, except for Atlanta and for Miami to Cuba. Notice the early hub importance of Chicago and Detroit. By 1934, there were 38 Georgia airports listed in this early edition of the Airway Bulletin of the Bureau of Air Commerce, including 2 in the Brunswick area. The first listed on the right is Redfern Field, which was on St. Simon's Island, and the second is Sawtell Field in Brunswick. First, I'll talk about St. Simon's Island. Redfern Field was approximately where Redfern Village is today. But then in 1936, land began to be bought up for a major new airport. Temporarily halted by the discovery of American Indian artifacts, the airport was finally completed in 1938 and named for its early supporter, Malcolm McKinnon. By 1939, there was an inaugural Eastern Airline flight out of McKinnon Airport. The onset of World War II ushered in a new era for McKinnon Field. In the first months of the war, the Civil Air Patrol was based there, protecting the coast from U-boat assaults. But in 1942, the U.S. Navy took it over and renamed it Naval Air Station St. Simons, NAS. It housed the Navy Radar Training School. Until 1947, when ownership returned to Glynn County and civilian use. Here's a picture of McKinnon today, and we're looking southeast. Jekyll is in the distant right. There's a little terminal building, part of the Hilton Suites on Demeray Road. If you haven't been in that little terminal building, walk inside. You'll see this Baby Lakes biplane hanging from the ceiling, rebuilt by the local Experimental Aircraft Association. Now let's turn to Brunswick. Sawtell Field was apparently about where the college is today. Or maybe it was where Brunswick Air Park soon began. This 1935 photo lists a pilot and passenger's names. McKinnon Field on the island was still the main municipal airport at this time, but Sawtell Field in Brunswick was important enough to merit a 1941 first-day cover commemorating the pre-war inaugural flight of the first scheduled carrier, Eastern Airlines. In 1949, Sawtell Field was replaced by Brunswick Air Park. We're looking northwest toward Peppertree Crossing, actually. The site of Brunswick Air Park was between 4th Street, at the bottom of the picture, Route 17 on the right, the Spur in the upper right, and Altama on the left. where the present-day county football stadium lies. Interestingly, you can still see traces of the runways just by looking for open space, like this. Brunswick Air Park was a busy place. Many current older pilots trained there. The air park closed around 74 to 75, a few years after our current civilian airport, Brunswick Golden Isles Airport, opened. Leslie Falconberry works for a St. Simons Island advertising agency whose clients have included the airport commissions. In 2004, when historic items were disappearing, she was commissioned to write this 193-page history of Golden Isles aviation. In 1942, with German submarines off the coast, the U.S. Navy selected Brunswick as the site of one of 5 airship stations on the eastern seaboard. Here you'll see the huge blimp hangar, number 1, being built. And this is the completed NAS Glencoe, looking south down Altima, showing very easily there. The 2 hangars, the 2 blimp hangars, and the launching field with a blimp on it are visible. NAS Glencoe lasted from 1942 until 1975. But early in that time, a new 8,000-foot runway was built to accommodate military aircraft in 1953. This is a 1961 view looking north with the runway in the distance across the picture. At one time, Naval Air Station Glencoe was the only facility in the world that employed all known forms of flight at the same time: airships or blimps, propeller aircraft, jets, and helicopters. But in 1959 arrived the new Nautilus-class nuclear submarines. Blimps were found useless. The subs were too deep, too fast, and with no revealing diesel exhaust snorkel. It took about 15 years before the blimp base finally closed in 1974. But already in 1971, the military agreed to share the field with civilian aircraft. Its 8,000-foot runway could accommodate larger jets than McKinnon Field could. So a passenger terminal was built, and Delta Airlines began offering passenger service at Glencoe in the early 1970s. This, our current, newer terminal, was built in 2005. In 1973, the alarming news arrived that the Navy would close NAS Glencoe, shutting down not only military aviation there, but civilian as well. The municipality worked hard to achieve the transfer of the airport to the county. That was in 1974. And then to invite FLETC to share the space in 1975. Today, there are 105 public use airports in Georgia, and 9 of those have regularly scheduled airline service. Not all the airports are shown here. The ones with colored dots are the weather reporting airports. Let's zoom in on southeast Georgia. This is what an aviation map looks like. It shows towns in yellow. It shows airports as colored circles. It shows identifying landmarks like rivers and railroad tracks. You can see the Altamaha River in a thick blue line across the upper right corner. And military operations areas that are the boxes. Next, our planes. This was our first plane, a Piper Cherokee in the 1990s. This was our Grumman Tiger, a speedy plane whose cockpit canopy could be slid back in flight. We owned this in the early 2000s. And this is our present plane, a humble little two-seater Piper Tomahawk. This is a cockpit view in our Tomahawk. Navigation instruments are in the upper left, communication instruments in the upper right, the throttle is in the lower middle, the yokes or steering wheels show, and the rudders are with the brakes on the floor. On a clear day, you can see forever. This is visual flight at 11,500 feet, as high as I ever fly. This is instrument conditions, instrument flight conditions in the clouds. If you look at the instruments, you can tell that we are flying north at 7,500 feet. We're climbing at 500 feet per minute. That's why the airspeed is only 62 knots. And the plane is banking to the left. A stall might occur unless I give it some right rudder and lower the nose. A little bit on our travels. These are some of the places I've flown to, as far east as Nova Scotia, as far south as Florida, as far west as Las Vegas, as far north as Alaska. I'll tell you about 4 of those flights. Corinne and I competed in Traverse City in a kind of road rally in the sky. Our plane was number 12 out of 17, and we placed 6th out of those 17. We flew 180 miles with a total error of only 41 seconds. I visited my son in the Washington, D.C. area. I landed north of Bethesda and Silver Spring in the middle distance in order to keep those military jets from bothering me. But you can see the Capitol in the far distance, downtown Washington. On another occasion, we caravanned with a barbershop buddy pilot to the International Barbershop Convention in Nashville, Tennessee. This is his picture of our plane. That's Corinne, visible in his photo. We visited Corinne's friend in Milwaukee, landing at the rather large General Mitchell Airport. I've just taken off from runway 7 right after dropping her off. Notice that this looks like 25 left, but the 2 ends of a runway are numbered according and named according to the direction of motion along the runway, either 250 degrees or 70 degrees. From Michigan to Georgia. Over a year ago, we moved permanently to Georgia, and it was time to bring our plane down also. Why not a straight line course from Pontiac, PTK at the top, to Brunswick, BQK at the bottom? I was avoiding the busy airspaces of Detroit, DTW, Cincinnati, CVG, and Atlanta, ATL, and also the higher Appalachian Mountains and the military operating areas in Georgia. It's an 8-hour flight broken into 3 segments. My 2 stops were in Frankfort, Kentucky, FFT, and Cherokee County Airport in Camden, Georgia, CNI. Saying goodbye to the Oakland Pontiac Airport. landing at Frankfort, Kentucky, where some radio problems delayed my trip till the next morning, which was okay because the next morning I had this beautiful sight as the sun broke out over the fog-covered hills. Into Georgia, where I am crossing I-16. This was 2 weeks after it was full of westbound Irma escapees. Approaching Brunswick. In the distance, in the middle distance, I-95. Beyond that, the airport, and beyond that, the marshes and St. Simon's Island. The Brunswick Golden Isles Airport is where our Tomahawk's new home is at Manning Aviation FBO, Fixed Base Operator. While I've been here, I've taken some friends flying, happy friends, Kathy, Ian, Myron, DeLeon. So I'll finish up with photos over the Golden Isles. These were not all taken in one flight, but I'm going to show them in a certain order, taking off from the airport in the middle, just above Dock Junction, and heading south and then clockwise up to Jessup and over to the coast and back down to the airport. So as I take off and I'm flying toward downtown Brunswick in the middle distance, this is over Glen Place Mall, looking south down Altama Avenue from its intersection with the spur. I'll give you a moment to identify those. Now we're over Glen Isles. Target, for example, is in the lower center. Still looking south. As we proceed south, I've got a closer picture of Georgia Pacific Pulp and Paper. You can see it at the right edge in this picture, and here's a little bit closer view. Here's the Brunswick Landing Marina. The Georgia Ports Authority. New cars waiting to be loaded onto cargo ships. Above Oglethorpe Bay and the Liberty ship sites with the bridge in the distance. Then I turn south to Jekyll Island. Here we are landing northbound, looking north towards St. Simon's Island, coming in for a landing at Jekyll Island Airport. After taking off further south, this is Cumberland Island. We're at the north end of it, looking south. The prohibited Kings Bay sub-base is at the far end, so in flying in this area, one stays away from that south end. Flew over to Jessup. Here's what Jessup Airport looks like coming in from the east. This is a view of Morningstar, which was originally called Boys Estate. There's Mudcat Charlie's on the Altamaha River, which is stretching into the distance toward the ocean. Looking down on Fort King George in Darien. Now we're flying north to Sapelo Island, or northeast. This is approaching the south end of Sapelo. And then from above the middle of the island, we're looking south. You can see the lighthouse. The Georgia Marine Institute is in the lower center, and the Reynolds Mansion is in the lower left. A little closer view of the Marine Institute and the mansion. Now flying out over the coast, there's a view of shrimp boats. And then coming down the coast, this is over Little St. Simon's Beach, flying south. Two views of Sea Island. One from the island and one from the sea. Then continuing south, this is East Beach. Looking south, Jekyll in the distance. King and Prince would be down toward the far end of the beach there, and the pier in the upper right corner. The beautiful Sydney Lanier Bridge from across the marshes of Glen. Here's Coastal Kitchen in the marina on the causeway. View of Brunswick from above the Torres Causeway over the marshes. We're looking northeast where Gloucester crosses Oglethorpe and Newcastle. Gloucester is running from low left to upper right. Mary Ross Park. Looking south along Union Street as it crosses Gloucester. We're looking south now. Gloucester crossing at the bottom, Union stretching into the distance toward the bridge. This is a close-up of the Unitarian Church in the middle of the picture. A view of the hospital. And what you've been waiting for, a view of Peppertree Crossing. This was taken a year ago fall, so the new buildings in phase 2 have not yet been built. And as we approach the airport, a final view of Fletsey, about to land at the airport.